November 3rd, 1997. Weldon Spring, Missouri. A man named Gerald Turbrock stands at the edge of a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, holding a photograph of his father. The photograph is black and white. His father is wearing a hard hat and smiling, squinting slightly against a Missouri summer sun that no longer reaches him. He worked at the plant for 11 years. He died of bladder cancer at 53. Gerald is 51 years old when he stands at the fence. He is 2 years younger than his father was when his father stopped being able to walk unassisted. Gerald is not smiling. Behind the fence, under a concrete dome the size of a cathedral nave, sits 1.48 million cubic yards of radioactive and chemical waste, uranium processing residue, DNT, TNT, contaminated soil, contaminated building material, all of it packed into a structure the government calls a disposal cell. What Gerald calls it is something different. He calls it his father's grave. The smell that morning is nothing. Clean Missouri air, autumn leaves releasing from the oaks along the perimeter road, the cold coming off the Missouri River a mile to the east. That is the worst part, Gerald will say later to a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who has come to the site on the same morning. It should smell like something. All those years his father came home smelling of nothing in particular. A faint chemical bite that Gerald assumed was normal, the way steel mills smelled, the way machine shops smelled, the way this plant smelled. His father told the family it was a steel mill. He told all of them that. The neighbors knew it as a steel mill. The church knew it as a steel mill. The government had told the workers what to tell their families. And what the workers were told to say was steel mill. It was not a steel mill. It was never a steel mill. It had never processed a single pound of steel in its operational life. In the summer of 1940, the United States government faced a production problem it could not name publicly. Europe was burning. The British were rationing ordnance. The Army Ordnance Department had run its numbers against projected war scenarios, and the numbers were stark. American explosive production capacity stood at approximately 11% of what a full-scale two-theater war would require. 11%. The gap between what the country could produce and what it would need was not a logistical problem. It was an existential one. The answer had to be speed, scale, and secrecy, in that order. Congress authorized emergency appropriations in the spring of 1941. The Army Ordnance Department identified sites. The selection criteria were specific and non-negotiable. Direct access to multiple rail lines, access to sufficient water for industrial cooling processes, minimum distance from population centers for buffer zone compliance, and acreage sufficient to isolate production buildings from each other, so that one explosion would not detonate an entire facility. A tract of land 30 miles west of St. Louis in St. Charles County, Missouri, met every requirement on the list. It had been farmland for generations, corn and wheat and soybean. Families who had worked the same ground since their great-grandparents broke it in 1850s. In 1941, the government acquired 17,232 acres through eminent domain proceedings. The average time from filing to acquisition was 61 days. Objections were noted and set aside. Acquisition to groundbreaking, less than 6 months. The Atlas Powder Company was contracted to design, build, and operate the Weldon Spring Ordnance Works. What rose from the Missouri farmland in the following 18 months was not a factory in any ordinary sense. It was a city built for a single industrial purpose. 55 production buildings, each separated from the others by minimum safety distances measured in hundreds of feet. Miles of internal railroad track connecting production buildings to the main yard. a water treatment plant capable of processing 3 million gallons per day, administrative facilities, supervisory housing. At peak construction, more than 11,000 workers were on site simultaneously, pouring concrete in winter temperatures that cracked the forms, laying pipe in ground that froze 18 inches deep, installing the massive hydraulic press systems that would shape raw explosive compounds into usable ordnance for an army that needed everything and needed it immediately. By early 1942, the Weldon Spring Ordnance Works was producing TNT and DNT, dinitrotoluene, in quantities that had never been achieved at a single American facility. The air inside Building 11 carried the taste of almonds in the first 5 minutes of a shift, a synthetic sweetness that settled on the tongue and did not leave it, not during lunch break, not during the walk to the parking lot at shift's end, not entirely by the following morning. The walls sweated with chemical moisture even in winter. The floors were stained a permanent amber yellow from processing residue that no amount of industrial cleaning fully removed. Men worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week and understood that what they were doing was keeping American soldiers alive. They believed that. They were not wrong about it. At peak production in 1944, the Weldon Spring Ordnance Works employed 4,100 workers on a single shift. The facility ran 3 shifts around the clock every day without pause for anything but mandatory safety inspections. The rail yard processed 47 loaded cars per day outbound, TNT blocks, booster charges, artillery shells loaded and sealed and stacked in wooden crates stamped with the Army Ordnance Department's red and black insignia. The hydraulic presses on the main production floor ran at a rhythm that men learned to feel in their back teeth and in the bones of their forearms before they could consciously hear it over the ambient roar of the ventilation systems. Senior press operators like Raymond Sievert could feel through the handle whether a charge was properly seated before the gauge confirmed it. That kind of knowledge was not transferable. It lived in a man's hands. Raymond Sievert had worked his father's farm 3 miles from the plant gate before the government took the land in 1941. He received $4,200 in compensation for 48 acres his family had owned for 80 years. He used the money to buy a car and move his family into St. Charles. He started at Weldon Spring on a Tuesday in March 1942 on the loading line. He was a line supervisor within 14 months. His workers ran the tightest floor in the facility, lowest error rate, lowest waste percentage, highest per-shift output in 3 consecutive quarterly reviews. The Army Ordnance Department commended the facility. The commendation named the plant. It did not name Raymond Sievert. What Raymond Sievert did not know, what none of the men on the production floor knew, what no one told them and no one asked them, was that the government was preparing a second use for the Weldon Spring facility. In 1955, without announcement and without explanation to the existing workforce or to St. Charles County officials, the Atomic Energy Commission entered into a contract with Mallinckrodt Chemical Works to process uranium ore concentrate at the site. Sections of the existing plant were modified for the new purpose. The ore arrived by rail from processing operations connected to the Belgian-Congo uranium supply chain, the same supply chain that had fed the Manhattan Project. What was produced at Weldon Spring was uranium oxide, a fine yellow powder that settled on every surface it contacted. The workers who encountered it called it yellow cake when they called it anything at all. Most of them called it nothing, because no one had told them what it was or why it was there. By 1966, when the uranium processing contract ended, the facility had refined approximately 2 million pounds of uranium compounds. The workers who cleaned the process buildings used standard industrial mops and water hoses. They wore no respirators. No one issued respirators. No one explained why respirators might be relevant. The contaminated water ran into the facility's drainage systems and from there into the soil and into the subsurface water moving east toward the Missouri River. The contaminated soil accumulated in low areas across the eastern section of the property. The contaminated structural materials, walls, flooring, ventilation ductwork, ceiling panels, remained in place in the buildings. Building 11, where the yellowcake residue had settled most heavily, was not decommissioned. It was cleaned with mops and returned to operational status. The specific decision made after the uranium processing contract ended, who made it, at what level of authority, under what legal framework, has never been fully established from surviving documentation. What is established is what happened. The Atomic Energy Commission conducted a decontamination survey in 1966. The survey identified 42 buildings with radioactive contamination measuring above acceptable limits. In the months following the survey, those buildings were demolished. The debris, radioactive concrete, radioactive steel, radioactive soil, was buried on site in unlined pits in the eastern section of the property where the drainage had already been carrying contamination for 11 years. The site was then transferred to the Department of the Interior. It was opened as a wildlife management area. Hunters used it in the 1970s. Hikers used it. Boy Scout troops camped on it. No signs were posted. No warnings were issued. The contamination maps produced by the 1966 survey were classified. Former workers had been filing complaints since the early 1970s. Letters to congressional representatives, letters to the Army Ordnance Department, letters to the Atomic Energy Commission's successor agencies. The Missouri Department of Health opened a registry of Weldon Spring former employees in 1986 following a series of investigative pieces in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The registry eventually documented 1,872 individuals with potential occupational exposure histories. The diseases recorded among registry participants, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, leukemia, bone cancer, matched the documented profile of long-term exposure to uranium compounds and aromatic nitro compounds. The Missouri Department of Health's published analysis stated that it could not establish causation. The government's official position remained consistent across 3 administrations. Causation could not be established. Raymond Sievert died on February 14, 1979. Bladder cancer, diagnosed in 1976. He was 58 years old. His wife, Dorothy, filed for survivor benefits through the Department of Labor's Occupational Exposure Program. The first application was denied. The second application was denied. On the third attempt, following a letter of inquiry from the office of a Missouri congressman, a partial benefit was approved, covering approximately 40% of the standard compensation rate. The paperwork approving the partial benefit listed Raymond Sievert's occupation as production line supervisor. It did not specify what he supervised. It did not mention the plant by its correct designation. It listed the employer as a general ordnance contractor. Dorothy Sievert died in 1993. She had spent 14 years in the application process. The disposal cell at Weldon Spring was completed in 2001. The project took 14 years from initial assessment to completion. It cost $993 million, the most expensive environmental remediation project in Missouri history, and one of the largest in the Department of Energy's Cold War legacy cleanup program. The cell contains 1.48 million cubic yards of material. Uranium processing waste, TNT and DNT contaminated soil, demolished building debris, contaminated groundwater treatment residue. The cell is engineered to remain structurally intact for a minimum of 1,000 years. A visitor center was built adjacent to the site. A marker was installed to warn future populations who may no longer understand what radiation is or what the symbols on the marker mean. The marker describes the contents of the cell. It does not describe the decisions that put them there. The concrete dome sits on the Missouri plain. The grass on the berm is cut short in summer, brown and stiff in November. The Missouri River catches the winter light a mile east. There is no sound from inside the dome. There is no sound from anywhere on the 170,232 acres that were once someone's farm and are now something the government calls a legacy site. The farmhouses are gone. The barns are gone. The corn rows are gone. What replaced them cost nearly $1 billion to contain and will need to be monitored for 1,000 years by whoever is responsible for such things when the government that built it no longer exists. The workers who built what is inside the dome were told they were making something necessary. They were right about that too.